Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest of our periodic webinars. We're just waiting for a few more people to arrive. We've got about 70 people due to join, and we're not far off that. So if you just wait half a minute or so. Okay, people seem to be joining at a slower pace now, so I think we'll get going. Good afternoon again. Thank you for joining us on this webinar about assessing risk management effectiveness. A lot of you will already be familiar with independent audit, but for those of you who aren't, just to mention that we're a specialist governance consultancy. We focus on helping boards make sure that governance frameworks are working well. So that's looking at the board itself. So we do a lot of board effectiveness reviews, but also we think it's important for boards to look at the effectiveness of the things that a board depends on. So that includes looking at, for example, the effectiveness of internal audit, the external audit, and at the moment we're spending a lot of time thinking about how boards go about looking at the effectiveness of risk management. And clearly that's the topic for today. Before I go any further, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Tim Anderson-Edward, who's just going to take you through one or two housekeeping points.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. Just a couple of things for this webinar. Firstly, you'll be able to ask questions at any time that we'll collect, and you can do that by using the chat box at the bottom of the webinar window on the right-hand side of your screens. If you want to get a better view, you can minimize that window just by clicking on the white arrow that's in a little orange box, and that'll help give you a better view. So just to start, Richard, why is it important to look at risk management today? Surely the Audit Committee and the Risk Committee have been doing it for a very long time.
Well, that's true, but what we're finding in our discussions is that well, two things have really changed over the last year or two, I think, in the discussions we're having. First of all, there's a growing sentiment that there needs to be a new way of looking at risk management, that the traditional processes have only gone so far, and that's largely what we're going to be talking about today. But also in the background, of course, there's been changes to the Corporate Governance Code, which have introduced greater expectations of audit committees and risk committees in terms of how far they need to keep an eye on the effectiveness of risk management throughout the year. So rather than it just being an annual assessment under the old Turnbull approach, now the expectation is there that they continue to look at effectiveness. So they're trying to think about how better to go about that. But I think largely the change has been this increased dissatisfaction with conventional risk management. Part of that means it's been possibly too much focus on the process and too much focus on definition of risk and categorization of risks under red, amber, green traffic light systems. So that's sort of leading to a feeling that really it's time for a fresh look at risk management. Sorry, I wanted to just move on the slide here, but there we go. Right, so slight hiccup there. Yeah, but it's time for a fresh look at risk management. So we find a lot of boards and executive committees are really looking to ask, how far does our risk management really support our strategy, support the implementation of our strategy? How is it really helping us to make better decisions and really get things right? How far is risk management really producing reliable assessments of exposures, or for that matter, resulting in actions that really help us manage risk to the level that we want it to be at? Or put that more simply, put it another way, is our risk management really having any impact?
So, Richard, is this entirely up to the audit and risk committees?
No, I think there's actually two different approaches here that are needed, two different angles to this. One is actually more for the board and the executive committee level, which is a question of stepping back and looking at the overarching risk management framework and how risk governance is working, and looking from that sort of quite strategic perspective as to whether risk management activity is actually having an impact, and also how the cost benefit of the investment in risk management, financial investment or investment of time, how that cost benefit is actually playing out. So I think that's a different, more strategic look. And we've been looking at that as well. And shortly, in a few weeks' time, we're going to be announcing a new approach to this, which is called Risk Reboot. And then that we will help companies look at the overall framework and how it's actually, how risk management is helping give the organisation strategic direction, what the value is, and the robustness of the overall risk management framework. But that's to follow. What we're looking at today is a second angle, which is more about how the committee, be that the audit committee, presumably, or the risk committee, or combined audit and risk committee, is actually going about assessing the effectiveness of risk management structures and processes. So what we'd like to do today is just set out a model for going through that sort of assessment approach. So what we'll do is we'll be setting out a model which has a bit of a different perspective.
Okay, well, this is the point, isn't it, about today? I mean, in terms of the difference, and in what way is it different?
Well, I think it's different because so far, often it's been a question of when companies are looking at effectiveness, that they're saying or asking themselves, do we have the right processes in place? Often the questions along the lines of, do they look like what we think they should look like, what the risk management consultants will typically put in place, and do they look like what everybody else has put in place over the last 10 or 15 years? And with this heavy focus on the risk management process. But I think that needs to change. I think it's more, we need to move to a mindset where instead we're saying, first of all, have we got a model for assessing effectiveness, which actually looks at the enablers of effective risk management, the things that need to be in place, the conditions that need to be in place for risk management to work well and have the required impact on the business. So we're moving to this is the start of the model that we're going to present to you. It's at the heart of the model is just this different way of looking at risk management.
Okay, so we've got to just stop there and just make the challenge again. Again, in what way is this model different to what people normally see?
Well, I think often people have thought about risk management in terms of risk management stopping things going wrong or stopping bad things from happening. As I said, often it's seen as a bit of a process. And it's time, I think, to take a different take on this and actually think in terms of risk management as a way of helping the business, helping management make good decisions and help make sure that things go right, which is maybe only a subtle difference, but I think it is an important one, because it does enable you to then look at effectiveness in quite a different way.
Okay, thanks for that. Good answer. What does that look like in practice, though?
Well, here's at the heart of the model. You've got I said the risk management definition, and around that, this is our model for looking at risk management effectiveness. There's 5 angles to it that you can see, starting at the top there with strategic direction. And I'm just going to walk you through these quite quickly from 2 different perspectives. First of all, the question of what do we actually need to have in place around each of these different angles. And then secondly, when we actually assess effectiveness, what do we need to look at? What are we actually looking for? So first of all, it's this first block of what does the effectiveness depend on when it comes to the aspect of the strategic direction. And really this is all about defining what risk management is supposed to achieve. So we're looking at expectations, looking at what people actually want to get from risk management, and then looking at how the strategic context is factored into the way risk management works, and as a result of that, who actually needs to do what. I mean, all too often what we see when we do board reviews or look at risk committees or audit committees, we find that risk management processes are assessed and operating in something of a strategic vacuum. and they fail to take into account the strategic context. Also, we're finding that the expectations of risk management are often not actually set out clearly. What does the board, what does the executive committee need from the risk management systems? Okay, how are they going to add value? How are they going to be used in day-to-day management of the business and execution of the strategy? And often these sort of expectations are just not set out clearly. And then when we look at the boards and the risk committees, often, yes, there's increasing activity around things like discussion of the principal risks or discussion of the viability statement in the context of the principal risks. But then there's this lack of linkage between the strategy that the board has been working on and what that needs to translate into when it comes to risk management. So effectiveness does depend on getting a lot of that in place. But the second area is having a clearly defined framework and setting out who does what and how that actually fits into day-to-day activity and decision making. But also looking at how it ties together within the framework, the risk appetite, the risk management activity, the management, monitoring, the reporting. How should all of this fit together? And so what do we see in practice? Again, we see boards who should be really getting to grips with how that framework works in practice. But often we don't see enough of that. Yes, in the financial services sector, we are seeing it. Obviously, because there's a push from the regulators, they expect to see it. So therefore, yes, you do look at the risk committees and the boards looking at it. But often, once the board has signed it off, it's not actually clear how that framework is then applied in practice in a coherent, integrated way. And once it goes into sort of execution, implementation, it becomes less clear how it's actually working and hanging together.
Well, presumably, Richard, there are quite a few different parts to this.
That's right, and we'll look at that a bit later when we actually look at the sort of questions you want to ask about. Okay, the third area is this question of the behaviours and culture that is underpinning sound risk management. So the effectiveness really does depend on people knowing how they need to behave. And what we see here is, again, in the financial services sector, a lot more being done around this with that regulatory push and also just a general awareness that obviously the softer side of risk management and controls is so important. But often boards and committees, it's quite difficult for them to get a handle on that. So I think people are edging forward. And it's the first stage of having much greater awareness and intent is in place. It's around just the practical challenge of forming a picture of the risk culture. Non-financial services, we see more focus on culture and behaviour more generally, but much less so in terms of the risk culture. I don't want to draw too much of a distinction between the two, but it's really a question of where looking at behaviours, whether there is that risk element to it, and when things like employee surveys are done, just really factoring in the approach and attitudes to taking risk and managing risk. And we don't see so much of that flavour or thread running through those sort of reviews. But the effectiveness also depends on how managers are actually managing taking risk into account. Again, I come back to the point I made earlier that so often risk management is seen as something of a process that's just done to people rather than being an integral part of how they actually manage things on a day-to-day basis, how it actually fits in with their decision making, how it fits in with their monitoring of performance and managing of their functions. So it's almost as though they're just waiting for the risk management function to initiate the tool-based risk management process or organise workshops. Those sort of aspects of risk management, typically RM systems. When do you next need my evaluation of the component, what's put into the risk register, for example, that sort of thing. Far too much emphasis on that, and not enough emphasis on how practical management monitoring actually takes place. And certainly I think audit committees and risk committees struggle at looking at that particular aspect. So there's a gap. On the one hand, they're satisfying themselves that that overarching enterprise risk management system is in place. On the other hand, they're looking at the more detailed aspects of internal control and audit findings, and the detail where, for example, risk exposures might exceed appetite. But there's something missing there in the middle, a gap, in terms of how management are looking at how management are actually doing this on a day-to-day basis. The last area is this question of learning from what went wrong. In terms of assessing the effectiveness of risk management, it's so important to look back and actually try to see what the impact of the risk management actually was, and also learning from events and incidents where risks have actually crystallized, and seeing what might have been done differently, might the risk management system have worked better, or how management actually responded to those events, and then adjusted the approach to thinking about risk or how the risk is being mitigated. So again, if we're asking the basic question, what does effectiveness depend on? I think this is an important part that is often neglected. At board level and at committee level, we see very little emphasis on actually analysing what happened and asking the question, what does this tell us about the effectiveness of our risk management? So again, it's just the focus on the process and was that in place, rather than did the process actually achieve what we needed it to achieve. So there needs to be this approach of really looking closely at learning from what has actually happened. So those are just to give you an overview there, what I've just run through is the sort of things that need to be in place, if you like, the conditions or the enablers that need to be in place to allow or enable risk management to be effective. So that's really what you want to have in place and see working.
Okay, well, thanks, Richard. So just to clarify, that's an overview of what needs to be in place. But what should an audit committee or risk committee actually do in practice?
I think what it needs to be doing is, rather than sort of commissioning internal audits to look at the ERM processes, it really needs to go about making sure that these conditions and enablers are in place, or at least asking how far they're in place. So again, if we just use the model to run through that, and the sort of questions really need to be looking at. I don't want to just run through the same points, so I'm not going to speak to each of these slides, but in terms of strategic direction, for example, it really is asking, how is that linkage made? How are the strategic objectives and the risk appetite actually linked into the risk management, for example? Once that's been done, how is that actually communicated to the business, like the managers who actually have to reflect this in the way that they're managing the business? Again, so often we find that there's that discussion of the risk appetite, the discussion of the strategy. Sometimes, if you're lucky, there's a good linkage between the two. So that goes okay just about. But then in terms of actually translating that, communicating that into what people need to do when they're actually executing the different parts of the strategy, the linkage seems to break down. So in going about trying to assess how far risk management is effective, it's that sort of question that you need to ask about in terms of the strategic direction. And then the second part, in terms of the framework, there's a few different elements to this, and what we'd be looking for is, within a good framework, is, again, this point of how the overall risk management approach links into strategic thinking, particularly in terms of how they think through, it enables people, the framework helps people think through scenarios, assess interconnectivity between different types of risk, and how it all works across functions. So that's the strategic angle. Then there's also this sort of assessing the risk and prioritizing the risks. Then there's angles around the different roles and the different processes that support all of that. And I don't want to play down the importance of process. It is important, and as is policy, the overall systems that support the risk management. It needs to be then complemented by so much else. So anyway, the framework will yes cover the roles and the processes, but also to be looking at the risk reporting. So you want to be asking questions about how the reporting to the executive and to the board actually makes a difference, the way they're assessing things, the way they're making decisions, looking at how risk issues get escalated, and then also just standing back and thinking through how useful is any of this reporting. And we're also used to seeing extensive risk management reports, often sort of only one step up from a detailed risk register. We're used to detailed red, amber, green traffic light assessments, but really, do we stand back and ask ourselves, what is this actually telling us about how we're managing risk, about our exposures, about the uncertainties we're having to manage as we on a day-to-day basis or going into the future? Sometimes those elements are just not there. And then another area is the risk management function itself. It is important to look at its effectiveness, how much it's actually contributing to the organisation and to the process, how it's actually responding to line management, and how these technology it's using is actually helping people manage. So I'm sure there are other aspects there, but that just gives a few groups of the things that you should be asking about.
Well, thanks, Richard. That was a very thorough response to my earlier question about what's in the framework. So many thanks for explaining that.
Sure. So then just, again, there's what sort of questions on coming back to the behaviour and culture theme. I won't run through this in detail. So it's really picking up on the points we talked about earlier. But what I would say is what we see here is often a too limited an approach to asking about behaviour or investigating behaviour. What I mean by that is that rather than look more expansively at people's attitudes towards risk and control in this particular risk appetite, the risk context, often the assessment of culture is too limited and overly focused on, for example, drawing on employee surveys. So very often when we see what boards are doing around this, they are looking increasingly at the results of employee surveys, for example, maybe looking at a few HR statistics, maybe also looking at some customer satisfaction statistics, that sort of thing. But if you look at it in the context of what needs to be in place to actually make sure that our risk management is sound, often that sort of risk angle is not evident. So they need to be looking much more closely at people's attitudes towards the risk appetite, how they actually apply the risk appetite, self-discipline in making decisions, for example, how their general attitudes towards compliance, and what sort of things they see as being the benefits from the risk management process, because if people recognize this value from something, then they're likely to behave, much more likely to behave in line with the way that you want them to. So again, in assessing risk management effectiveness, it's that sort of question you need to be asking. How is it actually changing people's behavior, but also how is people's behavior actually supporting effective risk management? Then there's the question of actually what management are doing. Again, I keep coming back to this point. So often we're satisfying ourselves with an ERM systems in place, but are we really asking the question, how are they actually being used by management? How is management actually integrated into that overall risk management framework? And so often what we see is, rather than management using it for monitoring and getting involved in monitoring versus appetite, or focusing on change, or reprioritizing business as usual risks, or analyzing root causes, those sort of things that we want to see, what we're actually seeing is too much focus on quantification of risk exposures and also quantification of the output. What I mean by that is, for example, debates over whether it's an amber or a green, or an amber or a red, and too much focus on that categorization and, in the sense, the measurement, rather than actually standing back, looking at it from a more qualitative point of view, more strategic point of view, in terms of looking at how it's actually helping us manage the business better. So from our point of view, if you really want to understand how risk management is being, how effective risk management is being, you really need to look at the way it's being applied by management and when it's being built into what they're actually doing. It's interesting because so often we get into discussions where people are very clearly recognizing that the responsibility for risk management has to be at the management level, has to be at the operating level, has to be at the first line level. Of course, that's right. But then when they look at risk management effectiveness, they don't look at that part. They look at the way the risk management function works and the way the ERM process works. And to us, that's just missing such an important part. So you need to get into the organization, understand how the risk management framework is actually being adopted and built into what people are actually doing. And just lastly, this question again, also important, of actually asking questions about the way the organization assesses what happened. And it would seem self-evident that one way you learn about how effective your risk management is to actually look at what happened and say, well, did our risk management actually help us? And we very rarely come across risk committees or audit committees or boards for that matter, actually asking that question. It's sort of when things have gone wrong or when something's happened, people just move on and learning is not always at the top of the agenda. So we think it's important to ask how far did risk management actually help us deliver on our strategic objectives? How far did it actually help us operate our business as usual processes in a sound way? Was risk appetite actually useful as a concept in helping us make decisions? Did we actually look at the root causes and what the behavioural angles were to things actually taking place? That sort of thing, and all the time looking to learn from what actually happened. So in our book, if you're going to look at risk management effectiveness, you really need to understand that part as well. It's all very well, yes, we've got a good system, we've got good processes in place, but what actually happened? Did they actually help you mitigate your risks? Did it help you make better decisions? Did it actually help you achieve your strategic objectives? These are the sort of questions that really, in our view, the risk management effectiveness question should be focused on. So that provides you with an overall model, which we think is a bit of a different basis to assessing risk, assessing the effectiveness of risk management. So that gives you a bit of a framework to think about, a framework possibly for your committees to work within.
Richard, thanks very much indeed. I'm sure some of you are wondering, how do you do this in practice, and are there any tools to help you? Well, funnily enough, we do have a solution some of you may be familiar with. This is our Thinking Board online tool. It's been designed to help you get across a lot of different people, possibly in different parts of business, and to really help get more out of a questionnaire-based approach. So it's been designed to help audit committees and risk committees to do ongoing effectiveness reviews. The questionnaire structure, which you're seeing on screen at the moment, helps people in all different parts, as I said earlier, think through the questions to get them onto the same page and looking at the underlying drivers. Because there's nothing worse than having a questionnaire which doesn't give you very much insight or confuses people in different parts of the business who might take the questions differently from each other. So having a questionnaire structure which helps you get around the business is very important.
So tell me, by that do you mean that if you look on the screen here, you've got these issues, are they called, on the right-hand side, what do they do?
Okay, so when thinking through a question, as I said earlier, it might mean different things to different people. This particular questionnaire structure has pointers or issues on the right-hand side, which you can think through and get your thinking going about what's underlying the question, what the question's really getting at. And people tell us actually that this doesn't replace comments, it provokes comments. It tends to get people really thinking through and adding that extra layer, which makes things so much more beneficial when conducting exercises.
I see. So it gets over some of the typical disadvantages of a questionnaire where you've got people perhaps interpreting the question in a different way.
That's right.
Or not really thinking through the question. I see. So that gives them the pointers.
Indeed. And in terms of how it helps you get a picture, it's very helpful in terms of giving you some instant reporting. So You can see if you do have any issues, how big they are. You can see what's causing them, even if you don't get very many comments, but we hope you do. And you can look across the business to home in and slice and dice the information that's coming out of the questionnaire to see if particular issues are being spotted by a part of the business or by a type of respondent, whether other people feel the same way for the same reasons. And helpfully, of course, that the reporting is all exportable to Word, so you can incorporate this into your own summaries too. So I think that gives you...
It's a bit, because it's a bit smaller than the screen.
Indeed, it is.
That one at the bottom with the, what do you call that, a heat map?
Yeah, that's right. So this heat map on the bottom is showing a view, and this is actually split out by country. So if you're a very large organisation and you want to look at the differences between responses between countries, business units or roles, you can. And in fact, one of the interesting things about this, if you are using heat maps, is to see the areas of greatest and least satisfaction. So you can spot the outliers too. So it's a very powerful tool to give you the insight that's going to make a difference to you.
Having been a little bit critical earlier about red, amber, green classifications, good here. So from here, in order to actually get under the skin of this, I can now drill down from there, presumably, to actually get more details around each country. Is that right?
That's right. It's in terms of homing in on particular areas. This will enable you to spot where things might need your focus, and just as you say, Richard, you can go into the detail, go into the countries, look at individual responses, not by name, but by, say, country or business unit. And what this allows you to do, in a way, is internally benchmark the effectiveness of risk management across your organisation.
So if I'm looking at this from a risk committee point of view, I may not want to get into too much detail. What I could do is home in on some of these areas, drill down, look at what the underlying reasons, or at least the underlying responses are, which are driving that summary picture, and then I can have that gives me a dialogue for a better dialogue for a better basis for dialogue with management.
Yeah,
understood.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz. So hopefully that gives you an overview of what the tool can do, but of course.
That's right, yeah. So as I was saying earlier, this is only really part of the approach. I think there being two parts to this. We've just been looking at the module we can use for looking at the effectiveness of risk management from the point of view of those who need to assess it. The audit can be the risk committee, possibly internal audit, or others who want to get that snapshot view of effectiveness of the risk management approach. But the other part I mentioned to you earlier was this question of standing back, and asking this bigger question. Is all this activity actually having an impact on the business? Is it actually having an impact on our strategic success? How is risk governance working in practice at the different levels, whether that's at the board level, the ex-committee, exco level, or the management level? But that needs a bit of a different angle and a bit of a different approach. So we'll be in touch with you about that in a few weeks' time to talk a bit more about our approach, which we're calling Risk Reboot. So that's really what I'd like to say today. Just have we got any questions?
Well, just to confirm one thing that we're getting through, we will be sending everybody a copy of these slides.
Oh, okay. Right.
So,
yes,
so you'll have this to hand.
So I think we've got two questions actually come through from you. The first one. Well, what kind of change is implied in using this model? Won't it cost a lot to change things? No, I don't think so. I mean, obviously, if you're using Outlook, there'd be a subscription fee. But in terms of changing things, I don't think so. In the sense that really, you're just starting a different conversation, and you're just taking a different look. So rather than asking internal audit, for example, to look at the way the process works, or look at whether the process resembles what we think it should look like, it's actually just a different discussion, a different dialogue. Maybe some costs in relation to doing some survey work in terms of actually trying to get a picture from across the organisation. But we're not here talking about a change in risk management systems or for that matter, really extensive research across the business into how risk management is working. It's really just getting that snapshot of how people think it works in practice for them. And then, as I say, just having a different dialogue, a different basis for that dialogue, and asking different questions. And that doesn't have to imply a large cost. Okay, another question how do we find the time to do this? I think it's largely the same sort of response, to be honest. It's having that meaningful conversation in the audit or risk committee, possibly in the exco. But it may take the time because it does require more thinking through, and obviously in order to build a picture and get these survey results, yes, that does take time. But if you actually ask the bigger question, how important is this? Well, actually, I think it's pretty important. If you're actually saying that it's really essential that in terms of our strategic success, that we are managing the risks, we are managing the uncertainties, how well are we actually doing that? That's a pretty important set of questions. So that would suggest to me that it's worth freeing up the time and making sure management do focus on this and giving enough time on the board or committee agenda. So yes, it will take more time, but I think it's just so important that you do have to free up that time to make sure it happens. No, I think that's it. Actually, I think that's the two questions that have come through. So we'll stop there. Thank you very much for participating today. Obviously, we'd like to hear from you. If you've got any questions or would like to have further discussion around this, we're always happy to meet people and take them through this in a bit more detail, or to show you the thinking board tool, or just have a general discussion about the overall approach. So do let us know if you'd like to carry on with this discussion. And in the meantime, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.